Today is draft lottery day, so we're shifting the content from playoff coverage and talking about the Leafs to going over to the prospects and talking about the teams that could be in contention for getting the best one this year. Now we are going to stream for today. We'll start things out about an hour before the actual draft lottery program comes on the TV, and if you've been around here for a while, you kind of know the drill. I'm going to be on my face cam, I'm going to talk to you guys, we're going to have a good time, and we're just going to watch the draft lottery results unfold live, and you're all going to see my disappointment when the Vancouver Canucks end up with the 13th overall pick. But either way, we're getting things going with a conversation about the team that won the lottery last year. Let's talk about the Montreal Canadiens and a quote that was kind of thrown around on the subreddit that I thought was interesting to go out there and acknowledge. So, last year, the Montreal Canadiens had themselves, as we said, the first overall pick. They drafted Juraj Slafkovsky over Shane Wright, and it was a pretty big deal. Here's a post made on the Habs subreddit by Rem Katra. It shows off an insightful quote from Chris Boucher on last year's strategy behind drafting Slafkovsky first overall. The quote comes from the YouTube video Inside the Canadiens Draft Meetings Behind the Scenes at the 2022 Draft, and it's a pretty simple one at that. This is what Chris Boucher, the director of analytics for the Canadiens, said in this meeting. If taking Juraj Slafkovsky means that we don't start drafting guys later for size, I think that's where the teams make mistakes, where they would start drafting guys because they're 6'2", and one guy who is 6 feet and say, we need size, we need size, we need size. If that stops us from doing that, it's already a win for me anyways. And this is a really simple quote, but I think it goes out there and says a lot, mostly because Juraj Slafkovsky was, as we said, a lot bigger than all the other players taken in this range. Logan Cooley, smaller guy. Shane Wright, not a small guy per se, but smaller than Slafkovsky. And then for Nemec, we're not really going to talk about him because the Canadiens weren't really going to have a significant chance at drafting him anyway. But with Juraj Slafkovsky going first, it already put that big behemoth of a man in the Canadian system. And there's another move they made on the same draft floor that also added a bunch of size too. The Kirby Dach trade. Sure, you got rid of Romanov, who's a pretty beefy dude himself, but the Romanov sort of experiment wasn't working all too well, and you traded him away for a draft pick. The draft pick was sent over for Dach, and Dach adds a little bit more size and a good element of offensive touch to that forward core as well. Because of this, though, the Canadiens did not need to focus on size later on in the draft. They already got Slafkovsky, they got Dach, and as a result, you saw them take a bunch of guys towards the middle frames that were huge value pickups despite being a bit smaller. The biggest one, obviously, that comes to my mind is Lane Hutson. Who's to say that if the Canadiens drafted, let's say, Shane Wright first overall, they wouldn't have opted for somebody that's a bit bigger because they need intangibles and they need size more so at that 62nd overall pick. This post here on the subreddit goes out there and mentions a few other guys. Philip Meshar, 5'10", Owen Beck, 5'11", Hutson, 5'8" at the time. It'll be interesting to see if they'll be able to use a similar strategy for this year's draft. Now, all those guys are pretty valuable prospects, but I'd go out there on a limb and say that Lane Hutson, in the way that he's performed this season, makes him a tad more valuable than a lot of these other players, mostly because, the guy had the best NCAA season since Brian Leach, so yeah. But either way, this is the opportunity that presented itself when the Canadiens drafted a big dude earlier on. And we've seen sort of the opposite happen once in a while. Like, I remember some of the other bigger dudes towards the end of the Canadiens' former drafts. Like in 2019, I believe there was like Arsen Kisamutinov. There are some other bigger dudes thrown in there. So it is a pattern that does exist and is worth acknowledging. You're not normally going to see draft classes for teams in the NHL be all under 6 feet or all over 6'3". Most teams like to get a mix in there. And for the Canadiens, we've seen with their scouting department, they're definitely not afraid to swing on upside, to go with the guys that are a lot smaller than most, because even if you go over to the past few years, you talk about Pitlick, you talk about Sean Farrell, Lane Hutson, Nick Suzuki, you could even say I know they didn't draft the guy, but they traded for him, and then the big one being Cole Caulfield. This team is really willing to go out there and take smaller players, and so for Boucher to go out there on the video and say essentially that Slafkovsky opens the door for them to doing that more, it makes a lot of sense to me. And so this year, you gotta have a conversation about where the team goes with their pick now. The Canadiens are projected to getting the 5th overall pick, but of course they have a chance at getting first. They've got an 8.5% chance. But with this draft, there aren't really too many guys that are extraordinarily quote-unquote big, in the same way that Juraj Slafkovsky was big. Connor Bedard has been noted as somewhat of an undersized center, but he's okay, because, Bedard is Bedard. You're not going to go out there and discredit that guy in any respect. Adam Fantilli is 6'2", Leo Carlsson is 6'3", so they're pretty decently sized. And then you have Matvei Michkov, who is a bit on the smaller side too, not to mention Will Smith, who is also not the biggest guy in the world. So right away, that's 5 names already that we just mentioned. The Canadiens are guaranteed to be getting at least one of them available to them in their draft spot if they draft 5th overall. And then there are some other guys too that are also thrown around in that conversation. I'd been seeing a lot of Canadiens fans wanting to get on the Dalibor Dvorsky train. We could talk more about other defensemen, Axel Sandin-Pellikka, Ryan Bacher. There are a few guys here that definitely range in terms of their size, but ultimately what I want to see the Canadiens do more of was just kind of what they did last year. Take guys that are a lot more valuable than their draft spot indicates and give them opportunities, whether they slip because they're small, they slip because they're Russian, or they slip because of other things that are kind of outside the prospect's control. Give them their opportunities. Of course, don't make it too good, because I kind of want my Canucks to do most of the brunt work when it comes to getting steals. That team needs more prospects than anybody, I feel. But either way, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. What are your opinions on this philosophy that was presented by the Canadiens last year with drafting Slafkovsky 1st overall, and how you think this sort of idea applies to this year's draft? If the Canadiens drafted, let's say, Shane Wright 1st overall, or heck, let's even say worst case scenario, Logan Cooley went 1st overall last year, and that guy's the smallest out of the bunch. Who knows if the Canadiens would have been interested in drafting bigger dudes towards the Meshar, Beck, and Hutson picks because they're trying to compensate on size. It's a silly principle in theory, but NHL teams are so silly in general, especially when it comes to drafting, that Cole Caulfield, the guy who had broken all the records and done all the crazy things there are to do as a goal scorer in the NTDP, slipped to 15th because he's only 5'7", and admittedly, that's a lot more of a dramatic example, but it is a thing that happens. You see guys that get taken a lot lower than they should be because they happen to be small. So for the Canadiens, with Caulfield himself, Lane Hutson, Sean Farrell, other small guys that they've taken over the years, as upfront and prime examples to their organization that, hey, this strategy works, I'm looking forward to seeing who the Canadiens draft in this year's draft. Of course, I don't want them to get Bedard because I feel like my Vancouver Canucks deserve him instead, but they've got a 3% chance at winning the lottery, so it's not going to happen. Thoughts in the comment section below, though. I hope you enjoyed this video. And bye.